I had a conversation with Herman and several other staff here at the IIIT last month when I was in Washington giving a talk on a similar subject, and so they invited me to join you for this program. And when I thought about, I have some historical examples that I'm perfectly happy to discuss with you in terms of the notion of pluralism in Islamic ethics. This is not a new idea. It's discussed in a lot of the literature, and the particular examples I have in mind are the engagement with the Greek philosophical ethics, and then changes that take place with recent history of colonialism. And that's something which I am happy to address and discuss with you, but I thought I would take a slightly different tack given the opportunity to have an exchange with particularly the two scholars who are close to me, Mahmoud Ayoub and Aziz Sachedina. I did something that I often recommend to my graduate students when thinking about a major topic. In other words, go to the reference works, the handbooks, and the encyclopedias and find out what the current state of research is on the subject. Whenever a subject comes up, civil society, whatever it might be, I think it's good to go to the reference works, not only the ones of Islamic Studies specialization, but things like the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, and so forth. And so I went to look for what's some of the current work on ethics, and I discovered there was a nice little handbook published by Blackwell a few years ago on the Handbook of Religious Ethics, which had articles on Islamic ethics by Kevin Reinhardt, by Ibrahim Musa, and by Aziz Sachedina. And what was really fascinating to me was these three scholars took completely different approaches to the subject. And so when you have a handbook which contains within itself a debate on the very definition of a subject, I think that's very interesting. So I'd like to explore that particular debate. In other words, how does one define Islamic ethics? And look at the implications of the different solutions that have been proposed. And I think the variation in the definitions is really quite fascinating. So, to begin with, Kevin Reinhardt proposes that Islamic ethics must be understood entirely in terms of Sharia. He excludes the philosophical tradition, ascetic and mystical tendencies, and theology. Aziz Sachedina, in contrast, sees theology as the key realm for the understanding of ethics, and excludes law from the primary focus of that category. Ibrahim Musa, in turn, not only introduces akhlaq in terms of the philosophical tradition, but also relates to adab as a comprehensive ethical norm, and draws even upon the Persianate tradition and the Sufi reflections on comportment, which he summarizes under term suluk. And even when considering the fiqh, insists upon the necessity of emphasizing the inner consciousness of the actor in addition to the acts which are under discussion. So these are really a wide range of definitions of Islamic ethics. And moreover, I find myself in an odd position of wanting to argue against Marshall Hodgson, which I don't often do. Because his well-known distinction between Islamic and Islamicate can have some unforeseen implications. Just to remind you, he stipulated that we could separate Islamic as meaning religious phenomena deriving from scriptural sources, whereas Islamicate would designate a broader cultural realm that includes non-Muslim participation and cultural forms. And in this connection, the term that stands out to me is culture. Where does culture figure in the understanding of ethics? Because Kevin Reinhardt specifically invokes Hodgson in deciding that he wants to focus entirely on Sharia as the definition of Islamic ethics. Because whereas he acknowledged what he called the impinging norms of earlier systems of ethics from preceding civilizations. He argues that we cannot determine the influences which they brought to bear on the emerging Islamic sphere. And so he feels that it's methodologically simpler to concentrate on Islamic ethics as being scriptural and juridical forms that develop directly out of that. And this, of course, is a point of view which has its defenders and is widely present in Islamic discourse today. And I was struck by his observation that, as he put it, theology ceased by the 12th century to be a significant moral science for Muslims. And this is a point to which I believe Aziz will take exception. And I'd be interested to hear his reflections on this, on these papers that were written perhaps almost a decade ago. But while it's true that for all three of these, well, for both Ibrahim Musa and Aziz Sajidina, the debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari school forms the crux of the major debate within Islamic theology in terms of free will and predestination and the nature of moral responsibility, whether it's objective or subjective. There are various other terms that are used to distinguish these two points of view. This is the main preoccupation which they have. Although I think that Ibrahim and Aziz have somewhat different projects that they are trying to address. For instance, Ibrahim concludes his essay by stating that the main challenges are, first of all, how to understand law and ethics in the way that they respond to change. In other words, to take account of change in law and ethics in the history of Islamic thought. Secondly, the second part of the challenge is how to retain the sacred character of law and ethics while it is undergoing change and still retain its, what he calls its salvific character. That's a very interesting formulation of a project to bring in history to the understanding of Islamic ethics, but at the same time to retain its sacred character. And he does not believe this is being done. On the other hand, the project that Aziz proposes is nothing less than the reinstatement of reason as a substantive partner of revelation to bring back the Quranic perspective on ethics. So those are rather different articulations of a project that would address the nature of Islamic ethics in the contemporary scene. But going back to the definitional side of things, let's back off for a moment. The term Islamic ethics is an outsider term. If you read the Arabic texts, or if I may also add the Persian texts and the Turkish text and others, you wouldn't find an expression that would be equivalent to Islamic ethics. You would find an expression meaning ethics. In other words, it was not considered to be a subset of one religion among many, but a question of universal significance. And so once we use the phrase Islamic ethics, we must acknowledge that we are in the discourse of comparative religion, in which it is assumed that there are different religions which have more or less similar structures or follow a template that is based upon a post-Enlightenment understanding of religion that was developed in scholarship that is based upon the history of Christianity and its concept of religion, and indeed of ethics. So we are using an analytical framework that is academic and is not replicating the indigenous theological positions of earlier Muslim texts. Fair enough. I mean, this is the way scholarship works. We have to use modern terminology, and there's always going to be a distance between the categories of scholarship and the substance of tradition, social life, etc., that we are discussing. But I think we need to acknowledge that. And at the same time, it occurs to me that these distinctions are more useful. For instance, the distinction between Islamic and Islamicate, or to define Islamic ethics in a particularly restrictive sense, whether it be in law or theology or whatever. These analytical distinctions are useful for scholars. They're useful for genetic and genealogical investigations, for considerations of sources, and so forth. But they are not particularly reflective of the life world of Islamic moral choice, which I think I would like to suggest we could consider it as something that is more integral, in which there is a fusion of the horizons of what scholars would consider different ethical systems. And this could be in something as simple as the way in which people in Afghanistan consider the customary code of Pashtun Bali to be basically completely consistent with Islam. They do not see any difference. And in casting about for some other examples, I picked up a copy of a Malay text from the 17th century, which was translated by a Dutch scholar under the title, An Early Javanese Manual of Muslim Ethics. A Javanese text written in Javanese script, so it was very local. And it had a catechism of Islamic belief, which was extremely familiar and would have been understood anywhere else in Muslim societies. But at the same time, it was deeply embedded in a local culture, including the narratives of the saints, the walis, who brought Islam to Indonesia and are identified as being the transmitters of this teaching. So the notion of locality and culture is indistinguishable, it's inseparable from the ethical authority that people receive in their particular social environments. And they are going to be different from one place to another because of language, because of history, because of many different other factors. So in this situation, I'm drawn to resist Hodgson's distinction of Islamic from Islamicate because I think that it is tending to essentialize and privilege some undeniably important textual and intellectual sources for ethics at the expense of many other sources of moral authority which are found in different Muslim societies, which it seems to me would be a mistake to ignore. And I speak from a historical point of view, but I think the issue is deeper than that. Because, and I'll come back to this issue at the end of my remarks, culture is the key problem here. But I'd like to give a few more examples, and then I'll revert to some of the historical cases that I had in mind initially. But one of the other things I picked up when I was looking at the, this is kind of an artifact of the library perhaps, but I went to the section where the books on Muslim ethics were held. And I found a great big book, which is a translation of a Persian text on fatwa. A term that's difficult to translate. Some people render this as chivalry, or what do you think, Ernie?
Manliness.
Yes. Yeah, manliness, chivalry.
Manliness in a virtue in a certain.
Yeah, manliness is not a good.
No.
Womanliness.
Yeah.
Well, the term virtue actually used to mean manliness in Latin.
Right.
So that might be because the word vir
Virtue.
is
Right.
So, and there's a vast number of ethical treatises, I'm thinking particularly in the Persian tradition, of advice. It goes back to pre-Islamic sources, of course. The term of andars is advice in Persian, and it's an ancient tradition. And
Javan Mardi.
Javan Mardi, right, is another term that comes out of that. These have an enormous influence over moral training, and they link people to the craft guilds with narratives of the supposed founders of the different professions who are often prophets and important figures of early religious life. And so to exclude this from the definition of Islamic ethics, it seems to me is making a kind of a interesting exclusion. Let's put it that way. What are the implications of saying that this is not relevant? Now, maybe just one other word on the articles of our well, as I mentioned, Kevin excludes the philosophical tradition and so forth. Aziz focuses on theology, and Ibrahim has a rather broader embrace of different approaches. And I was struck by the fact that he was willing to include non-Arabic sources in his purview. So that is pretty interesting. Now, let me just get into a brief reflection on the two cases that I have in mind of Greek philosophy and the colonial period to talk about change and historical development in Islamic ethics. And these are pretty well-known cases, and so I think we'll have plenty to discuss in your comments. But let me just offer these thoughts. The encounter with Greek philosophy was a very important one for Islamic civilization, and it's one of the reasons why we have to acknowledge that Islamic civilization is not just Islamic. The Greeks were one of a number of ancient cultures that contributed a lot and had very critical importance in what we later call Islamic civilization. The translation movement from Greek into Arabic was extremely important, mediated by historian Christians, oftentimes translated first into Syriac and then into Arabic. The whole experience of translation, of creating new terminology to convey sciences, logic, philosophical reasoning, metaphysics, was an enormous effort, and it resulted in a new series of categories and methods of thinking, which arguably became deeply embedded in the religious sciences as well. And of course, there were sectors of religious thought that were resistant to what were seen as foreign modes of thinking. But one can certainly observe powerful examples like Ibn Rushd, who insists upon the necessity of the study of philosophy for those who are qualified. In doing so, he exploits the ambiguities that were created in the process of translation. If you look at a text like his Fasl al-Maqal, the decisive treatise on the difference between religion and philosophy, it's a masterful demonstration of this method. I mean, he of course was a jurist who's well known for his work on Maliki law and on a very profound level. But in this particular, just to give you one example, he takes the term qiyas and he really works over the fact that this has one meaning in Islamic legal thought in terms of analogy, but it means syllogism in in logic. It means the Aristotelian model of rational deduction. And so he really is working on a couple of different levels to try to get across his point that the intellectuals are in fact required to master the tools of Greek philosophy, while the ordinary people who are unqualified should avoid it. So there's a fascinating ambiguity that goes on in his exploitation of this resource. And one could say even more ambiguous is the use of the philosophical tradition in Al-Ghazali, who, of course, famously repudiated metaphysical conclusions of the Greek philosophers and their adherents, such as Ibn Sina. But at the same time, he took on board quite a lot. And I think in particular, if you look at his treatment of ethics, there is a strong sense in which there is an elision between philosophical views of ethics and the states and stations of Sufi psychology. In other words, he, similar to Ibn Rushd, but in a more Sufi manner, is drawing upon that Greek tradition, but he's at the same time widening it to make possible the engagement with the introspective mystical psychology that was developed by generations of Sufi thinkers. This is not the only, there's a whole vast literature on this, and Hans Dieber in his bibliography of Islamic philosophy has pages of references to Muslim thinkers who are dealing with the ethical tradition. Aristotle's works, the ethics, the politics, furnish the basis for a series of writings beginning with Miskawayh and culminating in Tusi, and then in Persian, Dabani and others. And Muzaffar Alam has written about how this constituted a political ethic for the Eastern Islamic world that it's not Sharia-based, but it's really deriving from that philosophical tradition of going back to Aristotle. And I think in some ways this is a really underestimated tradition. If you read someone like Dabani, on the same page he'll be quoting hadith from the Prophet and the advice of Aristotle. It's kind of seamlessly integrated to him. So I won't try to summarize all of that type of information. I think everyone is aware that this is an important tradition. I'd just like to make a couple of quick comparisons to a few other ethical traditions that are also being drawn upon besides the Greeks. The political traditions of empire are all pre-Islamic. They are very ancient. They go back to the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Persians, of course. And Persian kingship and the Roman Empire formed very important models that were adapted and adopted by the early caliphate in a number of important respects. And so that notion of kingship, which is acknowledged in the Quran, the term for king and throne, these are symbols that are widely recognized, but they are certainly of ancient origin. That formed the background and the backbone of the great empires of not only the caliphate, but the Turkish and Mongol and subsequent regimes which had Islamic components and loyalties. But those empires were not defined by Sharia. And so not only was there a Greek political ethic, but there was this very important tradition of Persian kingship and its analogs, including the Mongols, that became part and parcel of what we call Muslim society. Other traditions were also popular as well. Think of the incredible popularity of Khalil wa Dimna. This is probably one of the most widely translated works in history. It originates in Sanskrit from the Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. These are famous political ethics in the stories of animal fables. And it was introduced into Arabic by Ibn Muqaffa, the famous vizier of the Abbasids, and became a really amazingly popular text for the dissemination of statecraft and political wisdom. So that's from India. And another example that I find fascinating is the Islamic engagement with Confucian thought. Sachiko Murata has published some striking studies about the Chinese Muslim texts produced in the 17th century, which are written in the vocabulary of Neo-Confucian philosophy. And if you didn't know that the author was a Muslim, you, assuming you were reading Chinese, knew this literature, you would find it very difficult to distinguish it from the standard literature being produced in Chinese intellectual circles. So there is a local culture of Chinese Islam that has a strong and positive engagement with a pre-existing ethical, philosophical tradition that seems to be worthy of consideration. And there are countless other examples of local custom and local cultures, and we'll keep coming back to that term. So it seems to me that if we talk about Islamic ethics in this broader sense, it's the Greek philosophical example is quite significant, and I think it has to be acknowledged that we can't understand figures like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd and the debates that they had without taking account of the embeddedness of Greek ethical thinking within Islamic civilization. And just briefly to turn to the colonial era, and I'll just give a few examples. The curriculum of Islamic learning in India that was popular beginning in the 1700s is the Dars-e-Nizami, an Arabic and Persian curriculum of text with a very heavy emphasis on the maqlubat, on the intellectual tradition. And texts like, texts on Usul al-Din, for instance, like the Musallam al-Thabut of Muhibbullah Bihari, were deeply engaged with the rational philosophical categories of thought in order to establish Islamic jurisprudence and law. But colonial rule eliminated the local sources of patronage of intellectual institutions, and there was a dramatic erosion of the kinds of institution like the Farangi Mahal Madrasa and other institutions that preserved this tradition. And so the new type of institution that was founded during the British period, like Deoband, which is interestingly established about 10 years after the failed Indian revolt against the British of 1857. had an entirely hadith-based curriculum. That was the main emphasis. It moved into a very different direction from the previous philosophical kind of curriculum. And of course, it adopted new forms of bureaucracy, of piety, and practices that were understandable in terms of the interaction with the British institutions of the time. And so that's just one example of a new kind of formulation of Islamic ethics, which is in a particular historical situation and is responding to pressures and needs that pertain to that situation. There are other changes that go on as well. Of course, rejection of slavery. This was a feature of Islamic law that had been present for centuries, just as it had been in many other cultures. And of course, as we move into the 20th century, democracy, human rights, gender issues, minorities, there are new forms of reflection that are taking place which relate to the changing situations. And perhaps most decisively, the emergence of the modern nation state as an entity of unprecedented centralization of power and monopolization of violence. And the nation state has become the site for defining religion. And it's through instruments like constitutions and the other apparatus of the modern state that new definitions of religion are being established today. So this is kind of a scattershot, series of examples which are meant to sort of provoke some reflection. I think that the utility of picking examples like the ones I've mentioned is that things which don't easily fit into our established categories are a good reason for us to reflect on what explanations there might be that would make comprehensible these seemingly anomalous cases. So just a couple of closing thoughts. Discussions of ethics today are oftentimes carried out in reference to major thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre, who in his After Virtue poses the problem of what kind of moral authority can be acknowledged in a world which is no longer unipolar and which has multiple competing traditions, and he has one particular proposal for that. Charles Taylor, in his discussion of secularization, also raises some interesting issues. I think that these kinds of theorists provide important questions that can be fruitfully addressed by people from a lot of different backgrounds. But I'm struck. I'll just conclude with one final question. I mentioned the term culture several times. Sometimes it occurs to me that the term culture is viewed as the realm of inauthentic existence in contemporary Muslim discourse, and I'd like to hear some responses to this. In other words, there's a tendency to isolate and idealize a particular concept of Islam in a way that is, in a sense, outside of history. And the only culture that in fact is included in that would be, let's say, the Sunnah of Medina, for instance. In other words, a particular golden age society that is bracketed off from the realm of culture in a very special way. But if we are to take recognition of this very broad range of examples of what I'd like to propose be considered cases of Islamic ethics outside of the canonical types of sources, it seems to me that culture needs to be theorized as part of this. And so how can that be done? How can culture be theorized in terms of Islamic ethics? That's a question and a project which I haven't by any means done anything but to propose, but I'd like to think about that with you. So I guess that has provided way too many red herrings and tempting trails, but hopefully we can generate some discussion, and I'm looking forward to your remarks.